They fired me 72 hours before quarterly earnings, the one moment Wall Street has zero patience for mistakes. I was the only person who knew how to reconcile the hidden gaps that kept our reports from imploding. Without me, the errors would surface live, in front of analysts, investors, and regulators. That's the kind of collapse you don't recover from. If you've ever watched arrogance erase years of your work, this story will feel uncomfortably familiar. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. They didn't wait until Friday or even the end of the month. They cut me loose on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of quarterly reporting prep, as if my name was just another line item they could delete. I had been with the company for over a decade, but Charles Benton, our CFO, delivered the news like he was swatting away an inconvenience. "We're restructuring," he said, not even making eye contact. Elaine Porter, the VP of Finance, sat beside him, nodding along as if the words were gospel. To them, I wasn't a person. I was headcount. 3 days before a deadline when every decimal mattered, they decided I was unnecessary. I didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't give them the satisfaction of panic. I just sat there, thinking of the irony. For 10 years, I had been the quiet reason our books always closed clean, the invisible hand that kept regulators from circling, the one who caught mistakes before they became scandals. Charles thought software could replace me. He didn't know that the software only worked because I'd bent it into shape with undocumented fixes and manual adjustments I never wrote down. Those weren't secrets. I'd raised them in meetings, flagged them in reports, asked for resources to fix them properly. They'd shrugged, said, "If it's working, don't overthink it." Now the person who held those fixes in her head was walking out the door, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Every number they sent to analysts was about to be built on sand. I left the meeting room without a word, past interns stuffing papers into binders, past junior staff who didn't yet realize what was about to happen. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, steady and cold, while I carried only my coat and the knowledge that they had no idea how fragile their system really was. They thought they fired a body. In reality, they severed the only lifeline they had. I didn't sabotage a thing. I didn't touch a file. All I had to do was walk away. In 3 days, when the first attempt to close the books hit the wall, they would finally understand the cost of treating me like I was disposable. For most people, accounting is just numbers stacked on top of each other like bricks. For me, it was survival. Every quarter for 10 years, I wasn't just balancing the books. I was keeping the entire structure from collapsing. Our systems looked modern on the outside, shiny dashboards and neat reports. But behind the scenes, it was a patchwork I had held together with instinct. Charles Benton, the CFO who thought I was replaceable, never saw the late nights when I stayed in the office with cold coffee and a calculator because the automated system couldn't match foreign currency exchanges without a manual adjustment. Elaine Porter, the VP of Finance, liked to brag that we were digitally streamlined, but she never knew I personally reconciled hundreds of line items the software flagged as anomalies. To the board, it looked like efficiency. In reality, it was my invisible labor smoothing over cracks that would have brought auditors crawling. The thing is, I never documented those steps, not because I wanted to hoard power, but because they were instinctual, muscle memory built after years of watching the same errors repeat themselves. A duplicate vendor ID here, a tax jurisdiction misfile there, payroll reports that never aligned unless I nudged them in the right order. I tried explaining this more than once. I sent memos. I even drafted process guides. Every time, Charles pushed them aside. "We're paying for software, not manual work," he'd say, convinced the tools were smarter than the person operating them. But the tools didn't save us from penalties when one tax code miscalculated overtime pay. I did. The tools didn't catch that a misaligned calendar entry could push revenue into the wrong fiscal quarter. I did. And every time, instead of fixing the root problem, they let me quietly correct it because it was faster. Over the years, those corrections added up to a kind of unspoken insurance policy, one only I knew how to maintain. I became the invisible buffer between the company and disaster. Nobody thanked me. At best, I got a perfunctory email from Charles with 2 words: "Good catch." But when the board praised him for seamless reporting, I just smiled, knowing my fingerprints were all over the numbers they celebrated. That was my mistake. I thought invisible work would eventually speak for itself. I thought being indispensable meant being safe. But invisibility doesn't protect you when leadership convinces themselves the machine runs on its own. So when they fired me, they didn't realize they weren't just losing a person. They were cutting out the only piece keeping the gears from grinding into dust. In their minds, I was gone. In reality, the moment I walked away, the countdown had already started. Charles Benton strutted through the office like every number bent to his will. He had a talent for speaking in broad strokes: profit margins, synergies, cost efficiencies, words that impressed the board but ignored the messy details that made those numbers possible. Elaine Porter, his second-in-command, mirrored him with practiced loyalty, parroting his confidence in meetings and dismissing any concern that hinted at complexity. Together, they made a dangerous pair, one blind to the ground truth, the other eager to validate his blindness. When I raised the issue of undocumented adjustments, Charles waved it off as paranoia. "That's what the software is for," he told me, as if QuickBooks and Oracle had supernatural powers to anticipate every quirk of our tangled ledgers. Elaine added her own sting. "If you can't automate it, maybe it doesn't need to be done." They didn't understand that the very stability they bragged about depended on manual threads I pulled tight. To them, my work was invisible because it wasn't flashy enough to make a slide deck. They assumed anyone could pick up where I left off because they never bothered to look closely at what I actually did. In their arrogance, they believed control came from titles and authority, not from competence. They were convinced the system could run itself because they had never been in the trenches watching it fail. The irony was almost perfect. Charles liked to say we needed to modernize by cutting dependencies. He didn't realize I was the only dependency keeping them safe. When he fired me, he thought he was proving a point about efficiency. What he really did was remove the single barrier standing between his empire and collapse. I didn't have to sabotage anything. I just had to let him be right in his own mind, long enough for reality to teach him what arrogance costs. The first morning after I was gone, the finance team sat down to close the quarter. On paper, the process was simple. Run the reports, reconcile, submit. In practice, it was chaos. Within hours, error logs began to flood their inboxes. Mismatched vendor IDs, unreconciled payroll entries, duplicate tax codes. The numbers didn't align, and every fix they attempted only spawned more discrepancies. By noon, they were staring at 112 unresolved mismatches. I knew the rhythm of those errors like the back of my hand. One had to be corrected before another. Revenue batches had to be closed in a precise sequence, and certain outliers only balanced if you applied a manual override in the right place. None of that was written down. To Charles Benton, these were minor bumps. He sent a curt message to Elaine Porter: "Keep the team focused. Push through." Elaine echoed his tone, telling staff to trust the system. But the system wasn't built to save them. It was built to look clean while I quietly cleaned it underneath. Without me, every hidden fracture started to surface. Junior analysts huddled around screens, arguing over which line item was wrong, each insisting they had fixed it, only to watch 3 new errors appear. The more they patched, the worse it became, like trying to plug leaks in a sinking ship with paper towels. By the second day, the backlog had doubled. Entire reconciliation cycles froze mid-process. Reports refused to finalize because prior corrections weren't applied in the correct order. Tension spread across the floor. Raised voices, coffee cups clattering, whispered blame. One intern suggested reaching out to me, only to be silenced with a sharp look from Elaine. "She's gone," she said flatly, as if repeating it would make the problem vanish. By the third day, panic set in. Deadlines loomed, screens glowed red with warning banners, and the so-called seamless software generated outputs no one trusted. The team pulled late nights, trying to brute force fixes they didn't understand, but every step forward only revealed deeper gaps. What had once been a smooth process in my hands had become an unsolvable puzzle. Charles still believed they could muscle through, blind to the fact that the damage was already irreversible. Watching from a distance, I didn't need to touch a thing. The collapse was righting itself, one error, log at a time, and every person in that building was beginning to realize what Charles refused to admit. Without me, the numbers would never add up. Deadlines don't wait for panic to settle. At midnight on the last day of the quarter, the reporting system executed its job as programmed. It auto-submitted the financials to the regulators. No one in the office had managed to reconcile the errors in time. Every mismatch, every duplicated entry, every failed correction was locked into the official submission. There was no pause button, no option to call it back. By dawn, the system had already transmitted a distorted picture of the company's health to Wall Street, to the SEC, and to every investor who was waiting for clean numbers. The finance team didn't even realize the scale of the damage until the rejection notices and discrepancy alerts began rolling in. Charles Benton tried to spin it as a temporary reporting glitch in a terse email, but the words rang hollow once regulators flagged the inconsistencies. Elaine Porter scrambled to hold emergency meetings, pushing staff to resubmit corrected data, but it was too late. The system had recorded the official version, and changing it meant triggering a review process that could not be contained. I had warned them for years that the automated pipeline only looked seamless because I was the one smoothing it. They never listened. Now the machine had spoken without me, and the machine was merciless. For investors, there is nothing more poisonous than uncertainty. By mid-morning, whispers spread beyond the office. A trading desk leaked the irregularities to a reporter, and within hours the company's name was flashing across financial news tickers. Accounting errors was the phrase attached, but seasoned analysts knew what that really meant. Weakness, exposure, the possibility of fraud. Phones lit up, messages pinged, conference lines filled with nervous voices. But no one could stop what had already been set in motion. The deadline had passed, the trap had sprung, and the company's own processes had turned against them. All I did was step away. The rest happened exactly as I knew it would. The regulators didn't hesitate. By January 2nd, the company received a formal notice, a comprehensive audit triggered by irregularities in financial reporting. It wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was a full-scale probe that froze transactions, halted payouts, and sent shockwaves through every department. Millions in potential fines loomed before anyone had even opened the first binder. For Charles Benton, it was the nightmare scenario he never believed possible. He had strutted into boardrooms boasting about flawless transparency and tight controls. Yet in the span of 1 week, his empire was exposed as hollow. Elaine Porter tried to stage manage the disaster, calling frantic meetings, drafting half-baked explanations, even blaming junior staff for data entry errors. But regulators don't bend to excuses, and investors don't forgive uncertainty. The morning the audit became public, news outlets plastered the company's name alongside words no executive wants to see. Investigation, freeze, red flags. Shares plummeted before lunch. Analysts labeled it an operational breakdown. Clients withdrew contracts. unwilling to gamble on a firm that couldn't balance its own books. Inside the office, panic hollowed the halls. Employees whispered in corners, some polishing resumes, others staring at error screens that now doubled as evidence. The finance team, exhausted and humiliated, stopped pretending they could fix what had already been submitted. The system logs were permanent, time-stamped proof that the errors weren't an accident, but the result of incompetence. I didn't need to plant sabotage. Their arrogance had done the work for me. The audit order was more than an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Recovery would take years, and in the corporate world, years might as well be forever. Charles tried to project control, assuring the board that the fundamentals remain strong, but his words fell flat in the face of frozen accounts and fleeing investors. For the first time, I think he understood the scale of what he had lost when he fired me. Not just an employee, not just a line item. He had cut out the one person who kept disaster at bay, and now the disaster had a name, a case number, and the full weight of the federal government behind it. The board called an emergency meeting the moment the audit order landed. No catered lunch, no glossy slides, just a long mahogany table and a silence that pressed on every chest in the room. Charles Benton sat at the head, shoulders squared like a man trying to bluff his way through a game he had already lost. Elaine Porter hovered close, flipping pages of useless notes, her face pale. The directors weren't interested in excuses. Mr. Harlan, the chairman, leaned forward first. Why weren't these risks disclosed? His voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was sharper than any shout. Charles fumbled with his pen, muttered something about unexpected anomalies. Ms. Rivera from the audit committee cut him off. Don't insult us. These weren't anomalies. These were systemic corrections. Who was responsible for them? Silence. Eyes darted across the table, but no one spoke. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The logs showed my name attached to years of corrections. The pinned memos I'd sent, ignored at the time, now sat in black and white on the screen. Succession plan requests, documentation drafts. Red flags labeled urgent, all unanswered. The board didn't need to raise their voices. Their silence was enough. Charles shifted in his seat. Elaine stared at the table. In that moment, they finally admitted what they had denied for years. I had been the system. My absence wasn't sabotage. It was exposure. The company had been balanced on one person's shoulders, and they had chosen to kick her out. The reckoning wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The damage was already permanent, the humiliation already public. All the board could do was stare at the wreckage and realize the collapse hadn't been caused by an enemy. It had been invited in by their own arrogance. I didn't watch the boardroom drama play out. By then, I was already gone. My desk was cleared, badge turned in, laptop wiped. No grand speeches, no slammed doors, no need. I had walked away the moment Charles Benton signed my termination papers, and everything since had been the consequence of that one arrogant decision. While they scrambled under fluorescent lights, I sat in a small cafe with my notebook open, sketching out what came next. No phone buzzing with urgent pings, no supervisor circling, just silence. For the first time in years, I could breathe without waiting for the next urgent correction to land in my inbox. I didn't need revenge. The system I had propped up for a decade collapsed under its own weight the instant I stopped holding it. That was enough. My name was already circling among recruiters who had read the headlines and understood the truth. But I didn't rush to answer. Power wasn't in the offers. Power was knowing I had been right all along. That invisible work isn't invisible when it vanishes. They called me redundant. Then they called me irreplaceable, but only when it was too late. My quiet exit had said everything I needed to say, without a single word. They thought firing me was the end of my story. But what they didn't see was that every spreadsheet, every correction, Every invisible stitch I had made in the company's fabric was also a timer, one they themselves had set the moment they decided I was replaceable. My silence wasn't surrender. It was the quiet countdown to a collapse they could neither predict nor prevent. What I learned from living through this is something many people in corporate America already know deep down. Invisible work is everywhere, and it matters more than anyone wants to admit. The truth is, most organizations run not on clean systems and perfect software, but on the dedication of people who go above and beyond in ways that never get listed on a resume. It's the analyst who catches an error before the client presentation, the nurse who notices a symptom before it spirals, the parent who balances two jobs without recognition. When leaders forget this and treat human effort like it's replaceable, collapse isn't sabotage, it's inevitability. My revenge wasn't in destroying anything, it was in walking away, in letting the weight of my absence show them the truth. And that's an important lesson. Sometimes the most powerful response to being undervalued isn't shouting or proving yourself again. It's leaving. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. Knowing your worth and refusing to hold up a system that refuses to see you. For anyone watching, the lesson applies far beyond corporate finance. Protect your boundaries. Don't let people convince you that your extra work is worthless just because it isn't visible. And if you're in a position of leadership, remember that the quiet competence you ignore today could be the very thing keeping your organization alive tomorrow. How to get started today. Write down one task you do that no one else sees, but that keeps things running smoothly. Acknowledge its value. Have one honest conversation this week where you state your contributions clearly instead of assuming they're obvious. If you feel unseen, start planning. Not just how to stay, but how to leave on your terms if you must. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments, subscribe to stay connected, and let's keep reminding each other that invisible work has power, because when it's gone, everyone finally sees what was holding everything together.